Dakota Territory, 1886. While his neighbors rushed to finish their cabins before winter, Lars Nilsson was still hammering away in late October, flattening tin cans by the hundreds. Every evening after field work, he'd split open tomato cans, peach cans, condensed milk tins, then nail them like fish scales across 6 feet of interior wall behind his wood stove. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Tom Callahan laughed that you could cook beans on that wall if it ever got warm enough. Standard frontier wisdom said a simple stove board and more firewood were all anyone needed. Lars built something different, 350 flattened cans covering 48 square feet, positioned 3 feet from his stove to catch and throw back every bit of radiant heat. Then January 1887 arrived. The big die-up winter hit without mercy. Temperatures plunged to 30 below, sustained winds at 40 miles per hour. In Tom's cabin, the stove glowed red hot, but 20 feet away, water buckets skimmed with ice. In the tin can fool's cabin, that same distance stayed above 60 degrees, warm enough that 9 people slept comfortably on the floor while the worst blizzard in Dakota history raged outside. What did Lars understand about heat, metal, and reflection that every other settler missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Lars Nilsson's homestead claim stretched 160 acres across the rolling prairie of Dakota Territory, marked by cornerstones and surveyor stakes that still smelled of fresh cedar. The Federal Homestead Act had drawn him west from Minnesota in 1884, carrying little more than carpentry tools, a basic understanding of log construction learned in the pine forests of Norway, and memories of his grandmother's kitchen where a polished tin reflector oven had sat beside the hearth, throwing heat back onto rising bread with such efficiency that she could bake twice as much on half the fuel. His cabin rose 16 feet by 20 feet, built from cottonwood and pine logs averaging 9 inches in diameter. 8-foot walls enclosed 320 square feet of living space that would shelter his wife Anna, their 2 small children, and Anna's aging father through the coming winter. Near the center of the single room, slightly offset toward the north wall, sat a simple box stove, cast iron, capable of burning split wood or coal, rated for heating spaces twice this size if properly fed. The stove represented their entire heating system, their cooking surface, and their margin between comfort and catastrophe once the Dakota winds began to blow. By late spring of 1886, Lars had begun collecting tin cans with the methodical patience of a man who understood that preparation, not luck, determined frontier survival. The railroad brought canned goods west in quantities that would have amazed his grandfather: tomatoes from California, peaches from Georgia, condensed milk from Wisconsin, beef from Chicago. His family alone emptied 5 to 8 cans each week during the growing season, and Lars flattened everyone. Using a cold chisel and a flat-faced hammer, he would cut away the top and bottom rims, open the cylinder along its seam, then pound the metal against a hardwood stump until it lay reasonably flat. Each finished panel measured roughly 4 inches by 6 inches, bright tin on one side, manufacturer's printing on the other. His neighbors watched this evening ritual with growing bewilderment. Tom Callahan, whose cattle range bordered Lars's claim to the west, made no effort to hide his amusement. That Norwegian's saving tin like it was silver dollars, he told anyone who would listen at the township's monthly gathering. Spends 2 hours every night hammering out tomato cans when he ought to be cutting more firewood or fixing his barn roof. The conventional wisdom of Dakota Territory held that winter preparation meant 3 things: enough split wood to last until spring, tight chinking between the logs, and perhaps a factory-made stove board to protect the floor beneath the stove. Anything beyond that was city folk foolishness or foreign nonsense that had no place on the American frontier. James Abernathy, who ran the general store and freight depot, reinforced this view with the authority of a man who had served as an army teamster and knew regulation equipment. Standard stove boards 30 inches square made of tin over wood, he would explain to customers examining his catalog. That's what the factory recommends. That's what meets clearance requirements. And that's what every cabin from Minnesota to Montana uses. He sold perhaps a dozen such boards each season, along with lengths of stovepipe, coal scuttles, and replacement grates. The idea that a homesteader might need 300 individual pieces of flattened tin seemed not just unnecessary, but actively wasteful. Yet Lars continued his work through the summer and into fall, accumulating panels with the steady determination of a man building an ark before the flood. His plan had crystallized during long evenings spent sketching in a small notebook, working out angles and distances with the practical geometry of a carpenter who trusted his hands more than formal equations. The stove would sit 3 feet from the north wall. The tin panels would cover a section 6 feet wide and 8 feet high, reaching from floor to ceiling in a broad rectangle that would catch the stove's radiant output and throw it back into the room. He calculated that he would need 300 to 350 panels, allowing for overlap like fish scales to prevent gaps where heat might escape or cold air might penetrate. The work required precision that went unnoticed by his critics. Each panel had to be nailed to the interior log wall with its reflective surface facing inward, positioned so that the overlaps shed any condensation downward while maintaining a continuous bright surface. Lars used finishing nails driven at slight angles, ensuring that the tin lay flat against the logs without buckling or creating air pockets. The overlapping pattern demanded careful measurement. Too little overlap and gaps would appear, too much, and the surface would become uneven, reducing its effectiveness as a reflector. By October, the wall had taken shape behind his stove. 327 flattened tin cans covered 48 square feet in a shimmering patchwork that caught and threw back the light from Anna's kerosene lamps. The surface was not perfectly smooth. No amount of hammering could eliminate every dent and ridge from cans that had traveled hundreds of miles by rail, but it was uniformly bright, uniformly positioned, and uniformly mocked by everyone who saw it. Johann Bauer, a German carpenter farmer whose own cabin sat 2 miles south, examined the work with professional curiosity tempered by skepticism. "It's well made," he admitted to his wife. "Neat joints, proper overlap, solid attachment to the logs, but I don't see how tin on the wall does anything a good hot fire won't do better." He had learned his trade in workshops where apprentices measured twice and cut once, where German stove makers had perfected tile and masonry heaters that could warm entire houses on remarkably little fuel. This American approach of throwing more wood at the problem struck him as wasteful, but the Norwegian solution seemed equally misguided in the opposite direction. Anna Nilsson kept her own counsel about the tin wall, but she tracked its construction with the attention of a woman who would spend the winter managing fuel consumption and room temperatures. She had grown up hearing stories of the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, when Lakota families had frozen in their lodges and white settlers had burned furniture to stay alive. Her mother had survived that season by preparing for the worst, not the average, and Anna recognized the same cautious wisdom in her husband's methodical collection of tin scraps. The wall was finished by the 3rd week of October, just as the first serious frost painted the prairie grass silver, and the wind began to carry the sharp edge that promised hard weather ahead. At the monthly community gathering, held in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church and meeting hall, Tom Callahan raised his cup of coffee and gestured toward Lars with elaborate courtesy. "Here's to our Norwegian friend and his tin barn," he announced to general laughter. "When winter comes, we'll see if you can cook beans on that wall, assuming it ever gets warm enough to try." The first storm of winter struck Dakota Territory on November 15th, 1886, arriving 3 weeks earlier than any settler had expected. Snow fell steadily for 18 hours, accumulating 2.5 feet against the north walls of cabins, while temperatures dropped to 8 degrees below zero. The wind held steady at 25 miles per hour, driving snow through chinks in log walls and around poorly fitted doors. For the first time since arriving in Dakota Territory, homesteaders began to understand that this winter might test their preparations more severely than the mild seasons of 1884 and 1885. Lars Nilsson lit his stove at 5 o'clock that evening, feeding seasoned cottonwood into the firebox with the measured pace of a man who had calculated his fuel supplies down to the cord. His neighbor Tom Callahan, whose cabin sat a quarter-mile across the frozen creek, performed the same ritual at the same hour, loading his identical box stove with splits from the same woodlot they had harvested together the previous spring. The two men had agreed that morning to conduct what Callahan called a little test, loading their stoves identically and measuring the results with mercury thermometers positioned at 3 points in each cabin. Both cabins measured 16 feet by 20 feet with 8-foot walls built from logs of similar diameter. Both stoves were cast iron boxes rated for heating 400 square feet, manufactured by the same Chicago foundry and capable of producing 20 to 25,000 British thermal units per hour when properly fired. The key difference lay behind Lars's stove, where 327 flattened tin cans created a bright metallic surface that caught the lamplight and threw it back in scattered reflections. By 7:30, the first measurements revealed patterns that would define the coming winter. Near the stoves, both cabins registered 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. At the center of each room, roughly 10 feet from the heat source, Callahan's cabin held 54 degrees while Lars's maintained 62, but the most dramatic difference appeared at the far walls, 18 to 20 feet from the stoves. Callahan's thermometer read 48 degrees, cold enough that frost was beginning to form on the interior, chinking between the logs. Lars's far wall held steady at 61 degrees, warm enough for comfortable sleeping without heavy blankets. Tom Callahan examined these numbers with the skepticism of a man whose worldview was being quietly challenged. He attributed the difference to tighter chinking, or perhaps better seasoned wood, though both men had split their fuel from the same cottonwood grove. "Could be your cabin sits in a better spot," he suggested, unwilling to credit the tin wall with any meaningful contribution to the temperature differential. "Wind hits mine more direct from the northwest." Yet, even as he spoke, he found himself studying the bright surface behind Lars's stove, watching how it seemed to glow with reflected heat from the firebox. The mechanism at work was simpler than either man fully understood, though Lars had grasped its essential principle from childhood observations of his grandmother's tin reflector oven. Heat from a wood stove radiates outward in infrared wavelengths that behave like light. They can be absorbed, transmitted, or reflected depending on the surface they encounter. The rough, dark logs of a typical cabin wall possess what physicists call high emissivity, meaning they absorb approximately 90% of the radiant energy that strikes them. This absorbed heat then conducts slowly through the wood to the cold exterior, where much of it is lost to the outside air. Bright metallic surfaces like polished tin operate on the opposite principle. With emissivity values near 5 to 10%, they absorb very little radiant energy and reflect the vast majority back into the room. This reflected heat continues to bounce between surfaces until it is either absorbed by higher emissivity materials like human skin, clothing, and furniture, or until it warms the air enough to create convection currents that distribute the energy throughout the space. The result is more effective heat distribution using the same fuel input. Anna Nielsen tracked these principles through practical observation rather than scientific theory. She noticed that standing near the tin wall felt noticeably warmer than standing near an ordinary log wall at the same distance from the stove. The metal surface was too hot to touch within 3 feet of the firebox, but merely warm at the edges, indicating that heat was being redistributed rather than simply absorbed and lost. More importantly, she could work comfortably at the far end of the cabin, kneading bread, mending clothes, or tending to the children, without needing to crowd around the stove itself. Johann Bauer arrived the following evening to examine the results for himself, bringing a carpenter's measuring tools and a methodical approach to understanding what he had witnessed. He confirmed the temperature differentials with his own thermometer, then spent an hour studying the tin wall's construction. The panels were nailed with their bright surfaces facing inward, overlapped to prevent gaps, and positioned to catch the maximum radiant output from the stove. "It's the same principle as a baker's reflector oven," he admitted to his wife later. "I should have recognized it immediately." Word of the temperature measurements spread quickly through the small community, though interpretations varied widely. James Abernathy maintained that proper stove operation and adequate fuel supplies were all any cabin needed. "Those thermometer readings don't account for drafts, moisture, or a dozen other variables," he insisted. "A good hot fire will heat any room if you tend it properly." Yet even Abernathy found himself examining the factory-made stove boards in his catalog with new attention, noting that they were designed primarily as fire protection, rather. than heat reflection. The early storm also disrupted freight service to the territory, stranding supply trains for up to 4 days when snow drifted across the tracks. This delay reminded homesteaders that their fuel supplies might need to last longer than expected if winter deliveries of coal or additional lumber were postponed. Lars calculated that his 10 cords of split wood would sustain his current consumption rate, approximately half a cord per week, through April with a comfortable margin. His neighbors, burning 3/4 to a full cord weekly to achieve less uniform heating, faced the possibility of running short by early March if the winter proved severe. The storm passed after 3 days, leaving the prairie locked under snow, and the community divided in its assessment of what the temperature measurements actually proved. Tom Callahan continued to attribute the results to variables other than the tin wall, though he privately began collecting his own supply of empty cans. Johann Bauer started sketching plans for a similar installation behind his own stove. Anna Nielsen simply added more split wood to their carefully organized stack, knowing that the real test of her husband's preparation still lay ahead in the deeper cold of January and February. The blizzard that would define the winter of 1886 to 1887 began on December 28th, with deceptively light snow and a gradual drop in temperature. By the morning of December 29th, sustained winds of 35 to 40 miles per hour were driving snow horizontally across the Dakota prairie, creating whiteout conditions that made travel between buildings impossible. The temperature plunged to 22 degrees below zero on the 30th, then continued falling until thermometers registered 38 below on New Year's Day of 1887. With wind speeds that never dropped below 25 miles per hour, the effective temperature felt like 55 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and kill anyone caught in the open. This was the storm that would later be remembered as the heart of the Big Die-Up winter, the same brutal cold that was simultaneously destroying open-range cattle herds across Montana and Wyoming. In dugouts and sod houses scattered across the northern plains, families huddled around inadequate stoves and watched their fuel supplies disappear with terrifying speed. Some burned furniture, fence posts, and even structural timbers from their own buildings in desperate attempts to maintain livable temperatures inside their shelters. Lars Nielsen's cabin faced the storm with methodical preparation. He loaded his stove twice each evening, once at 5 o'clock and again at 9 before banking the coals for the night. His fuel consumption followed patterns established during the November test. Split cottonwood burned steadily rather than frantically, producing consistent heat that the tin wall distributed throughout the room. On the coldest night of the storm, when the outside temperature bottomed out at 38 below, his thermometer readings told the story of reflected radiant energy working exactly as he had hoped. 3 feet from the stove, the air temperature held at 74 degrees Fahrenheit. At the center of the room, 10 feet from the heat source, the temperature remained at 67 degrees. Most remarkably, the far wall, 20 feet from the stove and directly opposite the tin reflection surface, maintained 63 degrees throughout the night. Water buckets placed along that wall showed no signs of ice formation. Boots and clothing left to dry overnight remained flexible rather than frozen stiff. The children slept comfortably under wool blankets without the heavy quilts and buffalo robes that other families required to survive the cold. Tom Callahan's cabin, a quarter-mile away, presented a stark contrast to these conditions. Despite burning his stove red-hot and consuming nearly twice as much wood, he struggled to maintain basic survivability. 3 feet from his stove, temperatures reached 72 degrees, virtually identical to Lars's readings. But 10 feet away, the air temperature dropped to 53 degrees, and at the far wall, his thermometer registered just 42 degrees. Ice formed inside water buckets overnight. Clothing stiffened into unwearable shapes. His family crowded into the small area directly around the stove, abandoning the rest of the cabin to the cold. The physical explanation for this dramatic difference lay in the behavior of radiant energy as it encountered different surfaces. In Callahan's cabin, infrared radiation from the stove struck the high emissivity log walls and was absorbed at rates approaching 90%. This absorbed energy conducted slowly through the wood toward the exterior, where much of it was lost to the brutal outside air. The cabin's heating became a losing battle against thermal conduction, with the stove working harder and harder to replace energy that leaked away through the walls. Lars's tin wall operated on fundamentally different principles. The low emissivity metallic surface reflected approximately 90% of the radiant energy back into the room rather than absorbing it. This reflected heat bounced between surfaces, gradually warming the air and creating gentle convection currents that distributed thermal energy throughout the entire space. Instead of fighting conductive losses, the system multiplied the effective reach of the stove's radiant output, creating uniform temperatures across the full 320 square feet of living space. On the second night of the storm, Tom Callahan's fuel situation became critical. He had burned through nearly a full cord of wood in 48 hours, double his normal consumption rate, and his carefully hoarded supply was disappearing faster than he had thought possible. More troubling, his family could not safely occupy the far end of their cabin, effectively reducing their living space to a small area immediately around the stove. When his wife mentioned that she could see her breath while working at the kitchen table, Callahan finally acknowledged that his conventional approach was failing. Anna Nilsson tracked their fuel consumption with the precision of a woman whose family's survival depended on accurate calculations. During the 3-day storm, they burned 3/4 of a cord, significant consumption, but well within their planned allocation of half a cord per week. More importantly, their entire cabin remained habitable. She could work at the kitchen table, tend to food preparation along the far wall, and manage the household routine without crowding around the stove. The children played on the floor throughout the room rather than huddling in a small warm zone. Johann Bauer, the German carpenter whose cabin lay between the two neighbors, experienced conditions that fell between the extremes. His tight construction and skilled chinking kept more heat inside than Callahan's hastily built structure, but without reflective surfaces to redistribute radiant energy, he still struggled with cold zones and excessive fuel consumption. On the storm's second night, he made careful measurements of wall temperatures throughout his cabin, pressing his hand against interior log surfaces and noting how they felt warm near the stove, but progressively colder toward the corners. By the third day of the blizzard, word had spread among the scattered homesteads that Lars's cabin was maintaining comfortable conditions for multiple occupants. When elderly Mrs. Patterson's dugout began losing its battle against the cold, her small stove overwhelmed by infiltrating air and inadequate fuel supplies, her son brought her through the storm to the Nilsson cabin. She slept comfortably on bedding placed along the far wall, 20 feet from the stove, in conditions that would have been impossible in any other shelter in the township. The storm finally broke on January 2nd, leaving snowdrifts 8 to 10 feet high and a landscape scoured by wind into hardened ridges and valleys. As neighbors dug themselves out and assessed the damage, the differences in winter preparation became impossible to ignore. Lars's fuel stack remained adequate for months of additional heating. His family had remained healthy and comfortable throughout the worst weather in Dakota Territory's recorded history. Most telling of all, his cabin had served as a refuge for additional people without strain on either heating capacity or fuel supplies. Tom Callahan emerged from the storm with a depleted wood supply, a chastened attitude toward conventional wisdom, and a growing collection of flattened tin cans that he had begun preparing during the blizzard's final hours. The mockery that had characterized community attitudes toward the tin wall was quietly replaced by serious questions about construction techniques, reflective surfaces, and the physics of radiant heat distribution in small enclosed spaces. By mid-January 1887, the Nilsson cabin had become an unofficial refuge for the scattered homesteading community. What began as temporary shelter for Mrs. Patterson during the New Year's blizzard evolved into a pattern of families arriving whenever storms threatened to overwhelm their own heating systems. The cabin's 320 square feet regularly housed 9 to 10 people during the worst weather. The core family of 5+ elderly couples, mothers with small children, and occasionally a bachelor neighbor whose dugout or claim shack had proven inadequate against the sustained cold. The mathematics of survival dictated these arrangements. Lars's tin wall created a zone of livable temperature that extended across the entire cabin floor, allowing people to sleep comfortably along the far wall where other structures remained uninhabitably cold. Anna spread bedrolls and borrowed quilts in careful rows, positioning adults and children to maximize warmth sharing while maintaining access to the kitchen area and the door. The reflected heat from the metallic surface meant that even the corners farthest from the stove maintained temperatures in the low 60s, warm enough for sleep with adequate bedding, warm enough for children to play safely on the floor. Tom Callahan's family arrived during the second major storm of January, when his cabin's fuel consumption had outpaced his supply and the far end of his single room had become genuinely dangerous. His wife carried their infant wrapped in every blanket they owned, while their 6-year-old son walked between the two cabins wearing 3 layers of wool clothing. Inside the Nilsson cabin, the boy's clothing steamed as it warmed, and within an hour he was playing on the floor in his regular clothes, a transformation that impressed Callahan more than any temperature measurement could have done. The fuel economics of this arrangement defied conventional expectations about heating capacity and wood consumption. Lars burned approximately 3/4 of a cord per week during the coldest periods, maintaining comfortable conditions for nearly twice his cabin's intended occupancy. His neighbors, heating similar spaces for fewer people, consumed a full cord or more weekly while achieving inferior results. The tin wall's ability to capture and redistribute radiant energy meant that each piece of split wood heated a larger effective area, stretching fuel supplies that had been calculated for normal occupancy and standard heating methods. Johann Bauer documented these differences with the systematic attention of a craftsman trying to understand a superior technique. He measured wood consumption at multiple cabins, tracked temperature variations throughout different structures, and began sketching plans for his own reflective installation. His German training had taught him to recognize efficient systems, and the tin wall represented engineering principles that transcended cultural boundaries. Heat was heat, reflection was reflection, and fuel economy was fuel economy regardless of whether the solution came from Norwegian traditions or American innovation. James Abernathy, the storekeeper whose authority rested on factory specifications and catalog recommendations, found his worldview challenged by practical results that contradicted established wisdom. His standard stove boards were designed primarily as fire protection, preventing sparks from igniting wooden floors, with minimal consideration for heat reflection or fuel efficiency. The Nilsson installation achieved both safety and performance improvements using materials that cost nothing but labor. When Abernathy calculated the wood consumption differences across the community, he faced the uncomfortable realization that his professional expertise had missed fundamental principles of radiant heat management. The transformation of community attitudes accelerated as word spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Homesteaders from claims 5 and 10 miles away began arriving to examine the tin wall installation, measuring its dimensions and studying its construction methods. They found a surface that extended 6 feet horizontally and 8 feet vertically, positioned 3 feet from the stove to optimize radiant energy capture while maintaining safe clearances. The overlapping tin panels created a continuous reflective field that caught virtually all the infrared radiation emitted toward the north wall of the cabin. Anna Nilsson emerged as an unofficial teacher during these visits, explaining the daily management techniques that made the system work effectively. She demonstrated how to position the evening fire for overnight heating, how to arrange bedding to take advantage of reflected warmth, and how to manage cooking and household tasks in the evenly heated space. Her practical knowledge complemented Lars's technical understanding, providing visitors with both theoretical principles and operational details they could implement in their own cabins. The safety considerations that had initially concerned skeptics proved unfounded in practice. The tin panels were nailed securely to the log walls with adequate air circulation between the metal and wood surfaces. The brightest, hottest sections of the reflective field were positioned well away from combustible materials, while cooler areas at the edges provided safe zones for hanging clothing or storing household items. Modern understanding of heat shield technology would later confirm that metallic surfaces with proper standoff distances actually reduce fire risk by lowering wall temperatures behind heating appliances. By February, half a dozen cabins in the township had some form of reflective installation behind their stoves. Tom Callahan's version used salvaged sheet metal from a damaged grain bin, creating a smaller but effective reflecting surface that reduced his wood consumption by approximately 30%. Johann Bauer constructed a more elaborate system using new tin sheets purchased from Abernathy's store, achieving results that closely matched the Nielsen cabin's performance. Each installation represented an adaptation of the basic principle to local materials and specific cabin configurations. The broader implications of these changes extended beyond individual fuel savings to community resilience during extreme weather events. Cabins equipped with reflective heating systems could shelter additional people without proportional increases in wood consumption, creating a distributed network of emergency refugees across the scattered homestead claims. This capability proved essential during late February, when another sustained blizzard struck the territory with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour and temperatures dropping below 30 degrees below zero. Red Eagle, the Lakota elder whose stories had influenced Lars's preparation philosophy, visited the cabin during a brief thaw in early March. He examined the tin wall with the interest of someone who understood survival technology from a different but related perspective. His people had developed sophisticated methods for maximizing heat efficiency in portable lodges, using hide linings and strategic ventilation to create comfortable interior conditions during harsh weather. The Norwegian homesteader's adaptation of reflective principles to frontier log construction represented the same fundamental approach, working with natural forces rather than simply opposing them through brute fuel consumption. The winter's fuel consumption tallies, compiled as families began anticipating spring, revealed the cumulative impact of reflective heating systems. Lars had burned 6 3/4 cords total while maintaining superior comfort and sheltering additional people throughout the worst weather. His neighbors, using conventional heating methods, had consumed 9 to 10 cords each, achieving less consistent temperatures and struggling to heat their entire living spaces effectively. The tin wall had multiplied heating efficiency by approximately 40% while providing the operational flexibility that had made his cabin the community's unofficial emergency shelter. The spring thaw of 1887 revealed the full cost of the big die-up winter across the northern plains. Cattle carcasses emerged from melting snowdrifts in numbers that would reshape the livestock industry for decades, with some ranches losing 70 to 90% of their herds. Homestead families who had burned furniture and structural timbers faced the prospect of rebuilding with depleted resources and no reserve supplies. The winter had tested every assumption about frontier preparation, separating those who had anticipated the worst from those who had trusted in mild precedents and conventional wisdom. Lars Nielsen emerged from the ordeal with his fuel supplies intact, his cabin undamaged, and his reputation transformed from village fool to respected innovator. More importantly, he possessed detailed knowledge about reflective heating that other homesteaders desperately needed. The spring months became a season of teaching as neighbors arrived to document his construction methods, measure his installations, and adapt his techniques to their own circumstances. What had begun as one man's eccentric project was quietly becoming the foundation for a new approach to frontier heating. Tom Callahan's conversion represented the most dramatic shift in community attitudes. The cattleman, who had mocked the tin wall as wasteful foolishness, now spent his evenings flattening cans and measuring distances behind his own stove. His installation used a combination of salvaged tin panels and sheet metal purchased from James Abernathy's expanding inventory of reflective materials. By late summer, Callahan's cabin featured a reflective surface covering 4 feet by 6 feet behind his stove, smaller than Lars's original but positioned and constructed according to the same principles of radiant energy management. Johann Bauer approached the problem with Germanic thoroughness, creating detailed drawings of optimal tin panel placement and calculating the mathematical relationships between stove distance, reflection angles, and heat distribution patterns. His cabin became a testing ground for refinements to the basic technique, different overlapping patterns, varying standoff distances, and experiments with multiple reflective surfaces positioned around the stove. His systematic approach yielded incremental improvements that reduced wood consumption by an additional 5 to 10% beyond the standard tin wall configuration. James Abernathy found himself in the unexpected position of sourcing materials for a technology he had initially dismissed as worthless. His store began stocking sheet tin, reflective panels, and specialized nails for heat shield construction. The factory-made stove boards that had once represented the pinnacle of heating safety now seemed inadequate, designed primarily for fire protection with minimal attention to thermal efficiency. Abernathy's catalog began featuring larger reflective installations that combined safety features with heat management capabilities, responding to customer demands that had emerged from the winter's practical lessons. The economic implications of reflective heating extended beyond individual fuel savings to broader questions of resource management and community resilience. A homestead that could heat its living space on 60% of the wood required by conventional methods could allocate the saved labor and resources to other essential tasks: additional food production, improved livestock shelter, or expanded crop storage. The cumulative effect across multiple families represented significant economic advantage for communities that adopted the technology systematically. By 1888, reflective installations had appeared behind stoves throughout the Dakota Territory and into neighboring regions where news of the technique had spread through family letters and railroad connections. Each installation represented an adaptation of Lars's original principle to local materials and construction methods. Some homesteaders used salvaged metal roofing, others employed hammered flat tin cans, and a few invested in purpose-made reflective panels from expanding commercial suppliers. The diversity of materials demonstrated the universality of the underlying physics. Any bright metallic surface positioned correctly would capture and redirect radiant energy more effectively than dark, high-emissivity log walls. The broader heating industry began to recognize these grassroots innovations as commercially significant developments. The American Stove Board Company, based in Chicago, started manufacturing decorative tin-faced panels specifically designed for installation behind heating stoves. These commercial products combined the reflective properties that homesteaders had discovered with factory-quality construction and standardized dimensions. By the early 1890s, stove catalogs featured heat shields that explicitly advertised their ability to reflect heat back into the room rather than simply protecting against fire hazards. Anna Nielsen's role in disseminating the technology proved as important as her husband's original innovation. She became the practical authority on daily management of reflective heating systems, teaching other frontier women how to position cooking pots to take advantage of reflected heat, how to arrange drying racks near the tin walls, and how to manage household tasks in the more evenly heated spaces that the technology created. Her knowledge represented the operational expertise that transformed a clever construction technique into a sustainable improvement in frontier living standards. Red Eagle's observations during his spring visits provided historical perspective on the adoption of heating innovations. He noted that successful survival technologies spread naturally among communities facing similar challenges, regardless of their cultural origins. The Norwegian homesteader's tin wall represented the same adaptive process that had produced indigenous heating methods, military field expedients, and commercial heating improvements throughout history. Innovation emerged from necessity, proved itself through results, and spread through practical demonstration rather than theoretical explanation. Modern building science would later validate the principles that frontier homesteaders had discovered through experimentation and necessity. Radiant barrier technology became standard in residential construction, with reflective materials positioned to reduce heat transfer through walls, ceilings, and floors. Laboratory testing confirmed that bright metallic surfaces with low emissivity values could reflect 90% or more of incident radiant energy, achieving exactly the results that Lars had observed in his Dakota Territory cabin. Contemporary heat shield designs for wood stoves incorporate both fire protection and thermal efficiency considerations, combining safety requirements with fuel economy benefits that homesteaders had pioneered decades earlier. The legacy of the tin wall extended beyond heating technology to broader questions about innovation, adaptation, and the relationship between traditional knowledge and frontier necessity. Lars Nielsen had succeeded not by inventing entirely new principles, but by applying familiar concepts, the reflective tin oven from his grandmother's kitchen, to unfamiliar circumstances in a harsh new environment. His willingness to ignore conventional wisdom and invest time in apparent foolishness had created a solution that saved fuel, improved comfort, and provided emergency shelter capacity when his community faced its greatest survival challenge. A century and a half later, modern homeowners install reflective panels behind radiators and wood stoves using the same principles that Dakota Territory homesteaders discovered during the winter of 1887. The materials are manufactured rather than improvised. The installations follow building codes rather than trial and error, but the underlying physics remains unchanged. Heat is energy, reflection is reflection, and preparation for the worst case remains the difference between comfortable survival and desperate improvisation when nature tests human ingenuity against the fundamental requirements of staying warm, staying alive, and helping neighbors do the same.